Greetings to all FIFAC students. We are now at week 9, in particular sessions 15 and 16. This week, we will discuss the different institutions in the Philippine government that have a hand in foreign policy. You will not only find out about the different actors in Philippine foreign policy, but also gain an understanding how these actors either compete against each other or coordinate to bring about a cohesive foreign policy for the Philippines. This week, we shall talk primarily about the following: the President and his office, the National Security Council, the role of the DFA in the Foreign Service, and other executive departments and agencies. Let us begin with the President and his office. As you have learned in the previous weeks, the President is both the head of state and the head of government of the country. The President leads the executive branch of the Philippine government and is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. As an institution, the Philippine Presidency is understood to have taken strongly after the American model, primarily through the period of tutelage the country went through in the Commonwealth of the Philippines. However, if one looks back in history, the leadership model may have had its roots earlier than that. Indeed, the Philippine Presidency is the oldest in Asia, according to Thompson in 2014, and has perhaps one of the longest traditions of presidentialism in the world. And this is according to Blondell, 2015. Even if it has not exactly been continuous, the presidency is considered by Filipinos to have started with Aguinaldo as the first president of the First Republic. Given the history of the fractious leadership of the uprising against Spain, with Bonifacio and Aguinaldo factions competing for legitimacy after the defeat of the Spanish colonial rulers in 1898, it is worth noting that Aguinaldo's dictatorial presidency, which was quickly followed by a revolutionary one, may have had a decisive role in setting up the character of the strong chief executive even before the Americans managed to put their own stamp of competitive electoral presidentialism into the institution. We have seen how Aguinaldo's primacy over Bonifacio and other competing autonomous power centers such as Antonio Luna can be characterized as the victory of the caciques or regional elites after the Philippine Revolution. The survival of the elite, in fact, was premised on their loyalty to the ruling faction, which was led by Aguinaldo. In this light, it is not surprising that the legitimacy of the presidency as an institution, whether the process for selection of the office holder is informal, forged through a crisis like war, revolution, or uprising, or a more formal one like elections, grant the institution of the president tremendous power. Scholars in Philippine politics from the 1950s have characterized the Philippine presidency as extraordinarily powerful. A recent comparative analysis cited the Philippines, together with Argentina, as examples of hyper-presidentialism due to weak constraints on the appointment powers of Philippine presidents, their demonstrated ability to circumvent legislative and judicial constraints, and their domination of theoretically independent regulatory and oversight agencies. We need not go far for examples of this in the current setup. I need not mention names, but perhaps many of you remember how a senator was sent to prison without being charged, thus violating constitutional guarantees of due process. How the chief executive was ousted on minor procedural or administrative questions. How military men are appointed to numerous positions regardless of competence or even the existence of a criminal record. How the leadership of a supposedly equal branch of government, such as the House of Representatives, was decided through presidential preference, or how a formal presidential aide now sitting in the upper chamber is understood by all to serve as the president's alter ego in the Senate. Indeed, Among presidential democracies, the Philippine president virtually has no equal in terms of aggregate executive power. So, what kind of powers does the president of the Philippines legally have? As head of state and as head of government, the president is vested by the Constitution with executive power to head the government's executive branch, including the cabinet and all executive departments, to grant reprieves, commutations, and pardons, and remit fines and forfeitures after conviction by final judgment, except in cases of impeachment, to grant amnesty with the concurrence of the majority of all the members of the Congress, to contract or guarantee foreign loans on behalf of the Republic, but only with the prior concurrence of the Monetary Board and subject to such limitations as may be provided by law, and to supervise local government units. As Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority to head the armed forces of the Philippines, to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and to declare martial law. He also has broad powers of appointment. With the consent of the Commission on Appointments, the President can also appoint the heads of the executive departments, board of members, and its leaders from any national government-related institutions, ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, high-ranking officials of the armed forces, and other officials. The members of the Supreme Court and lower courts are also appointed by the President, but only from the list of nominees prepared by the Judicial and Bar Council. Such appointments do not need the approval of the Commission on Appointments. Now, we have always heard that the President is the chief architect of foreign policy. Everyone, from top government lawyer, Solicitor General Jose C. Calida, to Secretary of Foreign Affairs Teodoro L. Locsin Jr. himself, says it. Actually, the Constitution does not explicitly say that the President is the chief architect of foreign policy, but this has been held by the Supreme Court in several rulings about the chief executive's power to negotiate and sign treaties or agreements with other countries, which may or may not require Senate ratification or concurrence. Of course, the President not only does that, but also determines the general direction of the country's foreign policy. It is not only President Duterte who does that, with his trademark pro-China, pro-Russia, and anti-US, anti-EU independent foreign policy. Practically every president since the time of Rojas has had a leading role in designing the Philippines' foreign policy. In the last half-century, Marcos, Ramos, and Arroyo were notable for their attention to foreign policy detail. Since week 1, we have had materials, either readings or videos, that illustrate the role of the President in foreign policy. In charting the overall direction of the country's foreign policy, the President can conduct direct diplomacy with his counterparts in what is called summit diplomacy. The President can do so by making working, official, or state visits to other nations, receiving or hosting his foreign counterparts or special envoys in the Philippines, as well as participating in international regional conferences and holding side meetings while he is there. So as we can see, the President can initiate, formulate, and implement foreign policy. What about the Office of the President? There are some agencies that assist in the formulation of foreign policy, considering that so many international laws and conventions affect domestic policy as well. These are government agencies that report to no specific department, but are instead placed under the Office of the President. Some of these are Basis Conversion and Development Authority, BCDA, Climate Change Commission, Commission on Filipinos Overseas, Commission on Higher Education, Commission on Human Rights, Cultural Center of the Philippines, Film Development Council of the Philippines, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, National Intelligence Coordinating Agency, National Security Council, Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, the Philippines Space Agency, Philippine Sports Commission, Presidential Anti-Corruption Commission, Presidential Security Group, and Subic Bay Metropolitan Authority. This just shows you the broad range of interests the Philippines have or are trying to protect overseas. Apart from these, there are also ambassadors at large or special envoys that the president can appoint. Unlike an ambassador in residence, who is usually limited to a country or embassy, the ambassador at large is entrusted to operate in several, usually neighboring countries, like Singapore does, a region, or sometimes even hold a seat in an international organization like the United States and ASEAN. In some cases, an ambassador at large may even be specifically assigned a role to advise and assist the state or a government in particular issues. Historically, Philippine presidents have designated special diplomatic envoys for specific assignments, primarily overseas but sometimes also within the country as an ambassador at large. Now, of all these agencies and the office of the president, the one that's perhaps the most crucial in the formulation of foreign policy is the National Security Council. The NSC advises the president in the formulation of integrated and rationalized national, foreign, military, political, economic, social, and educational policies, programs, and procedures that are vital to the security of the state. It is also said that it serves as the lead government agency to coordinate the formulation of these policies among various government departments and agencies that have implications on national security. The NSC is led by the President as chairman and counts the Vice President, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the Executive Secretary, the Secretary of National Defense, the Secretary of Justice, the Secretary of Labor and Employment, the Secretary of Local Governments, the National Security Director, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines as its members, or any other officials or private individuals the President wants to include. Under Duterte, Vice President Leni Robredo has been deliberately excluded. In previous administrations, even when the Vice President was a member of the opposition, there wasn't really a policy to deliberately exclude the Vice President in the Council. Let me just clarify that the NSC is different from the Philippine Council of State, which is an advisory body comprising living former presidents of the Philippines. The Council of State was famously convened in 2016, just weeks after President Duterte's inauguration. First established by the Americans in 1918, the Council was an integral institution under the Commonwealth, the Second Republic, and the Third Republic, until Marcos, who just stopped convening it under his 21-year rule. It was revived under Corazon Aquino, but lapsed into disuse until it was reconvened by Arroyo in 2005. Former presidents are, among other things, customarily made counselors of state for life, owing to their experience. However, unlike the National Security Council, it is not a regular advisory mechanism for foreign policy or national security, and indeed, its use can be seen as a tactical or public relations move, signaling political harmony or unity more than practical advice. Going back to the NSC, it was established 70 years ago in July 1950 by President Elpidio Quirino. But the idea for an NSC goes back to the Council of National Defense under President Quezon. The NSC itself was not used as a regular mechanism, but it has seen a revival since Arroyo convened it in 2002 to rally support for the war on terrorism. You would be too young to remember, but at the time, when the US under George W. Bush had just been attacked on 11 September 2001 for the first time since World War II, and was getting ready to invade Afghanistan with an invasion of Iraq also looming ahead. Since then, the NSC has been used as an active advisory mechanism. The NSC falls under the supervision of the Director General and National Security Advisor of the President. The NSA has a cabinet rank in the government. The current Director General and National Security Advisor is Secretary Hermogenes Esperon. Now let me take this opportunity to speak about my personal experience in participating in one of the regular meetings being organized and convened by the National Security Council. This is the National Task Force on the West Philippine Sea, or WTF-WPS, which I am attending as a representative of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Perhaps you are aware that I am Director handling the West Philippine Sea and Maritime Jurisdictions Division at the Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office, or MOAO, in the DFA. There is a pool of officers in our office who takes turns attending the weekly meetings of the NTF-WPS. Apart from MOAO, the other office sending representatives to this meeting is the Office for Asia Pacific Affairs, or ASPAC. Essentially, representatives of the different agencies meet once a week to discuss highly confidential or even secret intelligence about occurrences in the Philippine maritime zones, but with a special focus on the West Philippine Sea, which is the Philippines' EEZ and the South China Sea, the Luzon Strait around the Babuyan Islands, and around the eastern coast in the Philippine Rise and Philippine Sea. We also discuss special issues of concern, such as unauthorized sand quarrying, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in REEZ, marine pollution, unauthorized intrusions in our waters and airspace, marine scientific research, and hydrographic surveys. The NTF-WPS, which comprises undersecretaries or their representatives from 16 different agencies, including Foreign Affairs, National Defense, Environment and Natural Resources, Energy, Trade and Industry, Transportation and Communications, the Military, the Police, and Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, was created in March 2016 and essentially took over the functions of the Interagency Coordinating Committee. The NTF-WPS is responsible for orchestrating and synchronizing the employment of different national government agencies' capabilities to achieve Philippine objectives in Philippine waters and for providing recommendations to the President, as well as for providing guidance through the Cabinet Cluster in Security, Justice, and Peace. In order to better fulfill its mission, the NTF-WPS created 2 area-level task forces in the west in Palawan and in the north in Cagayan, which coordinates efforts between agencies at the regional level as well as organizes tactical level task forces comprised of units, assets, capabilities, and elements of different agencies. One observation I have is that the NTF-WPS is dominated by former military men who now occupy sensitive positions at undersecretary level at a number of bureaucracies. Given that they all finished at the Philippine Military Academy, they all seem to have a special understanding among themselves that may not be comprehensible or penetrable by civilians. At the same time, however, there are highly professional individuals among them with whom we've developed excellent working relations. At least, there is a keenly shared understanding about our dedication to defend and protect the Philippines across the different agencies, and that is what binds us. Does the NTF-WPS, as a creation of the NSC, formulate or implement foreign policy? Well, it is a coordinating body that regularly convenes to discuss issues of common concern, so I would say it boosts the motivations and improves, pools, and thus strengthens the kind of individual actions we would all be taking anyway as part of our respective agency mandates, but that we can now do so in a coordinated and a timely manner. There's just tremendous mutual respect in the NTF for each of our own competencies that we all have as takeaway a better appreciation of how we all function in government. Now we get to the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is, as all of you know, takes the lead role in developing and implementing the President's foreign policy through its foreign service posts, such as embassies, consulates general, and permanent missions, The Department of Foreign Affairs is also the primary representative of the Philippine government overseas. The official mandate of the DFA is to advise and assist the President in planning, organizing, directing, coordinating, and evaluating the total national effort in the field of foreign relations in pursuit of its constitutional mandate. Let's do a bit of history. If you managed to follow the previous lectures, you will remember that the DFA was first founded on the 23rd of June, 1898, in Aguinaldo's revolutionary government, under the name the Department of Foreign Affairs, Marine and Commerce, with Apolinario Mabini as the first secretary. That date remains the DFA's foundation day. It was confirmed as one of the cabinet portfolios in the First Philippine Republic of January 1899. Yet, with war erupting between the Philippines and the United States just 2 weeks later, the DFA was eventually dissolved on the 7th of May, 1899. With the U.S. colonial government taking charge of foreign affairs, defense, and currency, the Philippines did not take an active role in the crafting and execution of its foreign policy during much of the Commonwealth era. This is also the case during Japan's occupation of the Philippines from 1942 to 1944. With the granting of independence, the country regained full control of foreign affairs and diplomatic matters on 4th of July 1946, when Commonwealth Act No. 732 was passed, creating the Department of Foreign Affairs. On 16 September 1946, President Manuel Rojas issued Executive Order No. 18, which provided for the organization and operation of the DFA and the Foreign Service. The main tasks of the DFA then were to assist in post-war rehabilitation, formulate policies for the promotion of investment, and re-establish diplomatic relations with neighboring countries. The DFA experienced a heyday during the post-war years with its increased participation in the international arena. At that time, the international environment was beginning to change, requiring that new thrusts and priorities in Philippine foreign policy be determined. During the Cold War, against the backdrop of the Korean War in 1950 and rising communism in China, the Philippines projected an increasing internationalist foreign policy. The Philippines helped forge the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, in 1949. It became a founding member of the United Nations and one of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and was among the early proponents of disarmament and non-interference in the internal affairs of free peoples. The Philippines' visible engagement in global affairs culminated in Carlos P. Romulo's election as the first Asian president of the UN General Assembly in 1949 to 1950. Realizing the importance of foreign relations, President Elpidio Quirino pushed for the passage of the Foreign Service Law in June 1952, as embodied in Republic Act No. 708. During the post-war period, the Department of Foreign Affairs focused on institution building while simultaneously increasing Philippine global exposure. In 1953, Secretary Raul S. Manglapus instituted the Foreign Service Officers Examination to professionalize the Foreign Service and improve the recruitment and selection of new FSOs. Following similar efforts, earlier that decade, the Philippines joined with other Southeast Asian countries to become one of the founders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, in 1967. In order to ensure that Foreign Service personnel received adequate in-house training, the Foreign Service Institute was created in 1976. The FSI remains one of the 4 attached agencies to the DFA. The others are the Technical Cooperation Council of the Philippines, or TCCP, the UNESCO National Commission, and the Presidential Commission on Visiting Forces. The Philippines became one of the founding members of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, in November 1989, and an active player in regional efforts to establish the ASEAN Free Trade Area. In 1991, President Aquino signed into law the new Foreign Service Act of 1991, or Republic Act 7157, which reorganized the department along geographic lines and strengthened the Foreign Service. It instituted a career minister eligibility examination as a requirement for promotion of senior FSOs to the rank of career ministers, thereby ensuring the professional selection of those who would eventually rise to the level of career ambassadors. As you should know by now, it was under Republic Act 7157 that the three pillars of Philippine foreign policy were established. While the protection of overseas Filipino workers and Filipino nationals abroad was enshrined as one of the three pillars, it was not until the Flor Contemplacion case in Singapore in 1995 that this became truly equal to the first two more traditional pillars. Just a brief background on the Flor Contemplacion case. Flor Contemplacion was a Filipino domestic worker found guilty of strangling fellow Filipino worker Delia Maga and drowning 3-year-old Singaporean child Nicholas Huang, whom Maga was caring for. While there were signs of Contemplacion's mental instability, she was convicted through a confession drawn by the Singaporean police through interrogation. Given that Contemplacion failed to receive adequate attention or consular support from the Philippine Embassy in Singapore from the time of her arrest and throughout her trial, many in the Philippines believed Contemplacion did not receive a fair process. Indeed, due to her small size, there was sufficient doubt about her role in the deaths of Maga and Nicholas Huang. In fact, many were saying that the child may have died by accidental drowning and that the distraught parents killed Maga in a fit of rage. Many Filipinos believed that Contemplacion was innocent, or at least insane, blaming the Singaporean government for a lack of compassion and the Philippine government for not doing enough to stop the execution. The Philippine Embassy was specifically targeted for criticism for its failure to send a consular representative as an observer in court throughout the trial. As a result, then Secretary of Foreign Affairs Roberto Romulo and Secretary of Labor and Employment Nieves Confesor both resigned in the fallout from the controversy. A silver lining from this tragedy was the passage of the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act of 1995, or Republic Act 8042, which provided a framework for stronger protection of Filipino workers abroad, with the creation of the Legal Assistance Fund and the Assistance to Nationals Fund, and the designation in the DFA of a Legal Assistant for Migrant Workers Affairs, with the rank of Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs. Some other accomplishments by the DFA under the Ramos administration was the adoption by ASEAN in 1992 upon Philippine Initiative of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, aimed at confidence building and avoiding conflict among claimant states. The establishment of the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines BIMP or BIMP East Asia Growth Area in 1994, the establishment of the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1994 as the only multilateral security dialogue in the Asia-Pacific region conducted at the government level, and finally, the signing between the Philippine government and the Moro National Liberation Front in 1996 of the Mindanao Peace Agreement. By the end of the decade, and after continuing threats by China to take over islands in the Philippines' continental shelf, the Philippines sought to strengthen its defense partnership with the United States by forging a Visiting Forces Agreement, which was ratified in the Senate. I will discuss this in greater detail later on. Now, let's just look over the organizational structure of the DFA so that you will have an idea of what kind of priorities we've lined up through the different offices we have. The department is headed by the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, currently Teodoro L. Locsin Jr. We also have 6 undersecretaries, and in no particular order, they are the Undersecretary for Administration, Undersecretary for Civilian Security and Consular Concerns, Undersecretary for International Economic Relations, Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs, Undersecretary for Policy, and the Undersecretary for Strategic Communications and Research. The policy and geographic offices of the DFA manage political and economic relations in different regions and pursue Philippine interests in multilateral organizations. These include the following: the Office of International Economic Relations, the Office of American Affairs, the Office of Asian and Pacific Affairs, the Office of European Affairs, the Office of Middle East and African Affairs, the Office of ASEAN Affairs, the Office of the United Nations and other international organizations, and last but not the least, my office, Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office. The DFA's line offices are the following: the Office of Migrant Workers Affairs, the Office of Consular Affairs, the Office of Strategic Communications and Research, which is in charge of public diplomacy, the Office of Treaties and Legal Affairs, the Office of Policy Planning and Coordination, the Office of Protocol, the Office of Fiscal Management Services, the Office of Asset Management and Support Services, Human Resource Management Office, the Intelligence and Security Unit, the Department Legislative Liaison Unit, and finally, the Internal Audit Service. As for foreign service posts, we have a total of 94, and they're broken down into the following: 53 embassies, 27 consulates general, and 4 permanent missions. The DFA, of course, is one of the national government agencies involved in advancing the objectives of the Philippine Development Plan from 2017 to 2022. It is tasked to help enhance Philippine international competitiveness, which reflects the global scope and coverage of the DFA's work. In fulfillment of its mandate, the DFA must ensure that its activities and programs advance the interests of the Philippines and the Filipino people in the international community. As such, the DFA takes part in assessing the accomplishment of its annual objectives and adjusting them if necessary. As major final outputs, the DFA formulates, coordinates, and implements foreign policies through political, economic, cultural, and public diplomacy. It can do so unilaterally, bilaterally, regionally, through such organizations as ASEAN, APEC, ASEM, and FELAC, or internationally through the United Nations. Moving on, there are other national government agencies that are involved in formulating, coordinating, and implementing foreign policy. Let me name some of them: the Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of Environment and Natural Resources, Department of Health, Department of Justice, Department of Labor and Employment, Department of National Defense, Department of Science and Technology, Department of Social Welfare and Development, Department of Tourism, Department of Trade and Industry, and the Department of Transportation. The departments I've put in bold have sent attachés to Philippine missions overseas. There are also attachés from the Maritime Industry Authority, or MARINA, and the Philippine Coast Guard in London. Apart from having a fixed presence in Philippine missions overseas, some of these agencies attend interagency meetings called by the DFA for specific purposes, such as to solicit opinions, recommendations, comments, or outputs specific to an international meeting or conference, either being hosted by the Philippines or being attended overseas. They may also send representatives to meetings. We also have currently being proposed the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources to replace the Bureau, or BFAR, the Department of Culture to replace the NCCA, the Department of Overseas Filipinos, which may play a role in foreign policies if they are created through an act of Congress. While these government agencies demonstrate mutual respect to each other, the DFA is viewed as having primacy in foreign policy. In the foreign service posts, representatives of these government agencies function under the principle of the one-country team approach, with the head of post, either ambassador, consul general, or permanent representative, having the highest authority as the president's official representative in that specific foreign country. In representational terms, DFA officers, and sometimes even staff, use diplomatic passports, while other agencies use only service passports. In recent years, more and more agencies are seeking to send their own representative as service attachés overseas, such as the Bureau of Customs, the Philippine National Police, and the Bureau of Immigration. Indeed, there are few examples to the kind of attachés a country can send, and we have seen such examples as a cultural attaché, customs attaché, police officer attaché, labor attaché, legal attaché, liaison officer attaché, military or defense attaché, press attaché, agricultural attaché, commercial attaché, maritime attaché, and science attaché. If there are limitations, though, one can mention this: whether the DFA will agree to the derogation or reduction of one of its core functions overseas. Another one is this: there is the principle of reciprocity, that is, whether the country you are seeking to send an attaché is also willing to grant that function. Usually, it would be easier to obtain acquiescence or agreement from a bilateral partner if that country has the same priorities as you do. However, many countries generally agree to receive Philippine labor attachés even if they have no intention to send their own labor attachés to their diplomatic or consular mission in the Philippines, due to the established convention of the Philippines as a labor sending country. Ultimately, it is best to characterize the relationship of all these domestic actors in foreign policy as cooperative, with the directive emanating from the President, being implemented primarily by the DFA with the assistance of the other departments or agencies. So I hope through this presentation you are able to get a better picture of how Philippine government agencies function. Should you have any specific question or clarification, you are welcome to ask me at the first opportunity. Thank you for your attention.